There isn't really anything more intense in our world than fire.
There have always been fires in the West, and there's likely going to continue to be fires.
We live in one of the most active fire regimes in the United States.
The effects of wildland fire are long-term.
When there's a fire, it changes how people think about managing the landscape.
One thing that keeps me awake at night about fire is that it's just getting worse.
There's mounting evidence that wildfire frequency and intensity is increasing.
It really makes solving these problems and making some progress on the human and the natural side that much more urgent.
Fire kind of dramatically changes the system. There's this constant cycle of fire and then regrowth. How do you think about a landscape that's constantly changing and you have these very interesting spatial patterns? As a whole, how much water does it use? How do you think about ecosystem health when you have something that we know is going to burn periodically? The other driver of change in the landscape are humans, and humans do that by making decisions.
When we started out, we were trying to understand how do humans respond to the natural system. To get a handle on that, we wanted to test whether salience seems to be part of this process. Salience refers to this idea that when information is more prominent, people often overweight that information in making subsequent decisions.
Over 20% of the United States has deurbanized in the last 20-25 years. Populations are moving further outside of cities and into wildfire areas.
So the wildland-urban interface is essentially just the place where houses are either intermingling with wildland or are at least up against that kind of a landscape. Really, it's just a way of thinking about where might houses be at risk from wildfire.
When you're dealing with the wildland-urban interface, suppression interest is very high.
Firemen worked around the clock battling the raging flame.
For many years, there was an emphasis on suppression.
There are a lot of interventions in the system by government in particular that really limits how much people bear the consequences of risk. An example being that we have publicly provided wildfire suppression.
There's a couple of issues with that. One, suppression is expensive. It doesn't always work. And it turns out that if you keep suppressing fires in some forests, not all, you get a buildup of fuels that then leads to more severe fires in the future.
There's costs in suppressing the fire, there's costs in after the fire, but where we need to invest in what do we do before the fire? What do we do if you know that you're living in a fire-prone area? What steps can the community take to manage the wildfire environment they're living in?
When people really get involved and get engaged for wildfire prevention, it's typically too late.
When we think about wildfire, we typically think about suppression, because that's what we often see in the news. We're actually interested in trying to prevent wildfires that will cause damage to homes. It's harder to think in this more complicated system where you're trying to predict what might happen and trying to take what are really limited resources and distribute them across the landscape in a really effective way.
We started to investigate what the federal land management agencies do. They certainly do a lot in the realm of suppression, but they also manage fuels on the landscape.
Every Forest Service employee needs to understand why prescribed fire is now becoming our most effective management tool in restoring and maintaining healthy and productive watersheds and forests.
Another complex issue is creating defensible space and fuel breaks to help firefighters protect homes.
A fuel treatment really depends on what its goal is. Do you want to reduce fire behavior? Do you want to reduce competition for water? Do you want to change habitat characteristics? Fuel treatments can have different goals and then look different on the ground. As we explored where treatments were being done on the landscape, it was actually pretty surprising to find that they were happening closer to wildfires, places that had burned in space and in time, because that's probably not the place where you would place most fuels treatments.
A wildfire actually is like a big fuels management project. It removes a lot of fuel from the landscape. We found that the evidence is consistent with this salience notion that the people in the nearby wildland-urban interface community suddenly are thinking a lot about wildfire, and they put demands on their local national forest to go and do something about managing fuels.
It probably means we're not preventing as many wildfires as we could, protecting as many houses as we could. And it might mean other things about water, carbon storage, some of the things we care about out of the landscape. The whole premise of the SESYNC project was to start to get a handle on whether that might really be what's going on whether there really was a fully coupled system.
There's people, there's water, there's forests, there's climate. How do they all really come together and affect the things we care about? This project, I think so far we've been successful. I mean, we're publishing papers, we're also doing all this public outreach, but it takes a lot of work. You have to be motivated by wanting to do interdisciplinary work. This is the kind of work you need to solve these complex problems.